I'm Matt Chojnacki. I'm a new hire research scientist now located at the PSI Colorado office. And you can see some of my favorite geologic places on Earth. The bottom left is the slopes of Kilimanjaro. The bottom right is Hawaii. Iceland in 2014 in the upper right. And then Patagonia earlier in January at the Mars Polar Conference, which I attended. A little on my background, I'm a native of Colorado, so I'm really excited to be getting back to the Front Range. I received my bachelor's in planetary and physics at the University of Colorado in 2004, and then got my PhD at the University of Tennessee in 2013. Since then, I've been in Tucson at the University of Arizona, working with Alfred McEwen on a number of missions, the OSIRIS-REx mission and the HiRISE mission, both of which I was one of the leads of digital train model production. And I'm still doing that with the HiRISE mission. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone if they have questions about collaborating with those kind of data products. For my science talk today, I'm going to talk a little about some of the work we've been doing with HiRISE and digital train models and ortho images, looking at mega-ripples on Mars. You could see these are two oblique views of dune systems with these intermediate bed forms that I've got arrows pointing to, which are mega-ripples. And I'll show you some more examples in a moment. So many Aeolian bed forms on Mars are enigmatic as compared to classical terrestrial bed forms. For example, the origin of moderate scale light tone transverse Aeolian ridges have been long debated, as terrestrial features are rare. We see smaller dark tone ripples on dunes on Mars that generally don't form on Earth, implying a unique Martian process is involved. But the size range in between these commonly cited bedform populations has largely been unexplored and generally assumed to be inactive like transverse Aeolian ridges. Here we're going to describe the morphology and the dynamics of these Aeolian bedforms bridging these seemingly two different gaps. Here's four plots of HiRISE images of different Aeolian systems, all at the same scale, where I've labeled their no detection or active of these different bedform classes based on long baseline ortho images. In the top left, you can see the El Dorado ripple field that was investigated by the Spirit rover. And you can see there's tars and dark ripples that were both found to be inactive. The top right shows Jezero crater, where there were some dark tone ripples right on the edge of the delta that were found to be active, but there's other tars that were not. The bottom two plots show different Aeolian systems that are much more active, where all the bed forms labeled there are active. The ripples, dunes, and then the mega-ripples that you can see are quite different than the other bed forms in those images. Also, you'll notice the crests tend to be a little brighter. That's attributed to a coarser component of along those crests, maybe coarse grains that are creating a bimodal particle size distribution that is why we call them mega-ripples. In this active animation, you can see a whole range of bed forms that are migrating. The proto-dunes that are very close to the dune source in the North Polar Erg are migrating towards the top right, and the ripples are also migrating. In just the 2 Mars years, it's tough to track the smaller ripples, but the mega-ripples on the left with the arrows, you can see those are clearly displacing. There's some other ones in the troughs that haven't migrated yet, but that's just an example. And earlier in a study that we carried out just last year in a geology paper, we looked at dune systems across Mars using digital train models and ortho images and constructed volumetric sand fluxes estimates of those sites. And you could see in those, the red, orange, and green are the low, moderate, and high sand flux dune fields that we measured. And you can see the highest sand flux areas are along the North Polar erg towards the top of the plot, and then Syrtis Major, Hellespontus, all had high sand flux areas across a range of different dune fields. Now, when we looked at mega-ripples, our preliminary investigation showed that most of these high sand flux areas also had active mega-ripples. So that was the origin of our hypothesis that certain intermediate Aeolian bedforms on Mars, such as mega-ripples and transverse Aeolian ridges, are migrating in the current climate and can readily be identified based on their boundary conditions and proximity to high flux areas. And so that's the origin of this study that we're just starting. One of the early findings of that study was a paper that just came out a month ago in JGR Planets, led by my colleague Simone Silvestro and colleagues, looking at McLaughlin crater and Nili Fosse, where you can see there's a number of mega-ripples that were found to be active. The lower left plot shows the histogram of their wavelengths or spacing distribution, which is a common way to classify different bed forms. You can see those are range from 2 to 20 meters and are larger than the dark tone ripples. And even in the top left, you can see that those dark tone ripples you can barely make out compared to the brighter mega ripples. Looking at an animation in Nili Fosse, you can see the whole system is moving, the whole Aeolian system's migrating to the top left, and the ripples, the dunes, but also the larger mega ripples that are on top of the dunes migrating into transverse motion. We used digital terrain models to get the heights of the bed forms, to measure the displacements of the mega ripples. We used the COSI-Core software, which gives you allows you to quantify the displacements, but also the vectors and their orientation. So using those two, we're able to get sediment fluxes, and then we get the dune sediment fluxes using more traditional manual methods. In these two animations, while most of the mega ripples we've seen so far have a transverse motion, like in the left plot, the right plot dune with mega ripples on shows a much more complicated dynamics with non-transverse morphology, oblique motions, linear motions of some of the bed forms, just to point that out. Now on McLaughlin crater, we also found active mega ripples in Arabia Terra. A number of sites across the dune field, including those downwind, were found to be have these active bright bed forms that resemble transverse Aeolian ridges. For example, here in this plot, you could see some bright bed forms that are being buried by the dunes, and normally we would have seen those years ago in shorter time-lapse images and just noticed the dunes migrating right over them. In this example, over roughly 7.5 Earth years, you could see little crest bifurcations that are shifting downwind and migrating along with the dunes and the dark tone ripples. Now, why is that? It could be direct wind energy that's saltating some of the larger particles of the mega ripples, but also there's just a lot of sand moving through this corridor, and that could be just saltation impacts onto the coarser particles that's causing surface creep, and over long term you can detect some migration. Looking at the left plot, we quantified the sediment fluxes by looking at the heights versus the migration rates, and the lower sediment flux mega ripples are clearly separable compared to the dunes, a few orders of magnitude less. We also looked and compare that with different dune fields that weren't showing mega-ripples on the right. And you could see the bottom few lines are examples like Gale Crater and Becquerel Crater, where they just were lower sediment fluxes for the dune fields, whereas the higher sediment flux dunes did have active mega-ripples, lending some support to our hypothesis. So with that, here's a summary of our of the presentation, and hopefully I have some time for some questions. Thank you.